you very much for being with us. So just let me introduce briefly Professor Helbing. He's a professor of computational social science at the Department of Humanities, Social and Political Sciences at ETH Zurich. He also holds a position at the Delft University, of where he leads the PhD school in engineering social technologies for a responsible digital future. Dirk Helbing started as a physicist, and he helped to establish the fields of socio-econo and traffic physics. He worked at the Dresden University of Technology, where he became the managing director of the Institute of Transport and Economics. He discovered that crowd disasters are caused by a phenomenon called crowd turbulence and worked on ways to describe, reduce, and respond to disasters. He also had several visiting scientist roles. At ETH Zurich, he has worked on evolutionary game theory and agent-based computer simulations of social processes and phenomena. Professor Helbing is an award-winning scientist with many publications, including more than 10 papers in Nature, Science, and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. He has been involved in many initiatives, including the Future ICT initiative that helped to establish data science and computational social science in Europe. I've actually seen talks by Dirk Helbing twice. For the first time, it was in 2015 at the Monte Verita workshop in Ascona, organized by ETH Zurich on social norms and institutions. And I think a year later at the annual meeting of the Thurgau Institute of Economic Research at the University of Constance. I remember his talks as highly inspiring, thought-provoking, and critical, like really providing strong model support to a number of fundamental social and political questions of our time. Yeah, thank you very much for dedicating your time to our group, and I'm really looking forward to your presentation today. So yeah, the screen is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for the kind invitation. You know, I'd love to be at the beach, but unfortunately this is all virtual. And I'm going to talk about how networks can change everything for better or for worse. No question, we're living in a networked time. Everything is being connected more and more through digital technology mostly, but also through electricity networks, logistic networks, airline networks, and so on. And so basically whatever we do tends to have an impact on other people and on the environment, and the intended effects will not always come about in these kind of complex systems. Instead, we will often see side effects, feedback effects, and cascading effects. And that brings us, of course, to networks, because for cascading effects to happen, you need a network. And in many cases, of course, those cascades are probabilistic. And that basically this combination of risk and complexity creates uncertainty a situation. This is very well known from COVID-19 and how to respond to it, but there are many more examples, of course. A good way to visualize those cascading effects is an experiment that I'm going to show you now. So, as you can see, basically, a very small perturbation could actually mess up the entire system, as one event causes further events, which cause, again, other events, and so on and so on. And a system in which those kinds of dynamics actually can occur is the electricity network or power grid. So we remember still that back in 2006, there was a blackout in many areas of Europe. It was caused actually by switching off one line in order to allow a big ship to pass. Of course, one had calculated scenarios beforehand, but apparently an additional line failed, and that caused those blackouts. And the surprising thing is, the biggest effect doesn't always have to be close to the source of origin of the problem, but it could be somewhere else. So over here in that simulation, the problem originates in Spain, but the biggest effect will be in Eastern Europe. So look at this. And that is kind of the danger, that as everything is connected, problems that occur in some remote place in the world could have a serious impact on our own country and neighborhood and life. In fact, just very recently, we've read this newspaper article, which basically says Switzerland is not well prepared for a double disaster, kind of a combination of the pandemics and a power blackout. And that brings us actually to the other disaster, namely the pandemics, which is also, in a sense, a problem that results from a cascading effect. Now, of course, the idea is we could measure whenever somebody falls ill, and basically we would know the place and time and who that person might actually infect. It means the neighbors, colleagues, friends, whatever, you know, and this way we could anticipate the dynamics. It turns out, however, if we had such a globe that flashes whenever somebody falls ill, we would look at the data, we wouldn't understand the dynamics very well. As you can see over here, the spreading of data is very wide. There's a large scattering. There's no linear relationship. And so basically, this is just a big mess, just the mess that we're seeing right now. Why is this? Now, as compared to the times of the Black Death, we're not anymore seeing a diffusive spreading of diseases, but instead people are traveling often large distances. They're using planes. Well, not anymore, obviously, but that has obviously helped to spread also COVID-19 in the early stage of the pandemic. And the question is, what implications are there for the spreading of a disease? First of all, it messes up the dynamics, as I said before. But on the other hand, if we take the data of those travel patterns, I mean, travel volumes between airports in the world, then it's possible to define a new effective distance. So basically, Frankfurt and New York would be very close by. And some other cities like, you know, Zurich and Stuttgart may actually be more distant than that. In that new effective distance representation, we see a circular spreading pattern. So basically, this diffusive pattern is back. This allows us to determine the source of the disease, I mean, case 0, patient 0, and also to anticipate the further spread of a disease and which are the cities that would be hit next by the pandemics. And in principle, that would allow us to prepare by basically putting medicine and also medical personnel into these places in an anticipative way. The way we manage the pandemics right now seems to be very different. I don't know why politics didn't learn from what we did back in 2013, you know, it's 8 years ago. So in these simulations over here that Dirk Brockman has created, you can beautifully see how the geographic spreading pattern actually translates into this diffusive spreading pattern on the left. So in the beginning, you know, it's very slow, but then quickly the problem amplifies and accelerates. And if we look at how all of this depends on the connection density. So suppose we have a global system and we would add a large distance connections. So people would take the plane to other places, right? These are the blue lines over here in that symbolic representation. Then basically, as long as the connection density is low, there will be a few infected people. While then, as you increase the connection density, basically there is a point where things get totally out of control, very suddenly, and you don't see it immediately. Well, in the meantime, everyone, of course, can very well imagine such a dynamics. It's a very troublesome situation. And again, a very similar situation can occur in the financial system, as we've seen back in 2007 and 8, when the financial crisis struck. Yes?
Can I just before you go to the next example, could you just say what was studied in that one paper in 2013? What was it that was spreading?
I think it's H1N1, if I remember right.
Okay, so bird flu.
But there have been other diseases that Dirk Brockman has been looking at, also Ebola and of course COVID-19. So he's doing that regularly.
Okay, thanks a lot.
I think it's a very powerful method.
Mm-hmm.
Back to the financial crisis then. So Lehman Brothers went bankrupt, and as a result, a cascading effect set in, and actually hundreds of other banks also went bankrupt, eventually causing at least 100 times bigger problem, losses of billions of dollars. And in fact, in the meantime, I think it amounts to many trillions. So the system totally got out of hand, and the problem is still largely unsolved. If you hear politicians talking about plans to counter the pandemics of the order of 2 trillion, you know that something's very worrying here. Okay, this thing started with the connection density in the banking network passing a certain threshold, and then suddenly that cascading effect set in. A similar thing can happen actually in social systems. And one of the things that people are very much worried about is cooperation. Here in red, people are the defectors, non-cooperative people. And it turns out with neighborhood interactions in a circle, actually there's a tendency towards cooperation. Neighborhood interactions are actually often favorable for cooperation. Now let's assume a process of globalization where we add in further links connecting people. So we drop random links over here, and for some times the situation is still good, but we'll see that eventually we'll see a turnaround and defection will take over. So we have a situation that you can see summarized in this picture over here. As we increase with low connectivity, the number of connections, first the percentage of cooperation goes up. So we would go on networking the world to improve cooperation, right? But then eventually there is a certain critical connection density above which cooperation would eventually go down, 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 down. And in the end, cooperation would fail, creating a tragedy of the commons as we see it in many areas of the world. Governments around the world are now trying to stabilize this with a lot of police force, but it's probably not going to work. You need to have the right kinds of social interaction mechanisms to bring cooperation on the way. It doesn't have to be organized in a centralized way. There are many mechanisms that support cooperation based on local interactions. That means on social networks, actually. All right. Now, we also have networks of networks. That means complex interdependencies between different network systems. That makes the situation even more difficult. So sure, the networking has many benefits, but it also promotes cascading effects, in particular in a hyper-connected world, and that creates new risks. And blackouts are just one of those risks. And of course, we can imagine that this would have secondary and tertiary effects. So basically, traffic lights would be off. That would create large-scale congestion. Public transport wouldn't work. Trams, for example, and trains. We would have gas stations out of order. Water would have to be boiled because it wouldn't be fresh. But how do you boil water without electricity? And so on and so on. So basically, you can imagine that one trouble causes the next one, and it could basically end up in an apocalyptic scenario. So on the other hand, you can look at past events of disasters, such as earthquakes, for example, and you can reconstruct those cascading effects. In this way, you can basically use those causality networks in order to anticipate future scenarios and be prepared for the next thing that might happen in order to stop the spread of the disaster. That means to stop the cascading effect. You can do that for all kinds of disasters, and you can also look at common elements of disasters that are occurring for many different kinds of disasters. And you could also look at how different disasters are interconnected. So for example, earthquakes could actually cause tsunamis, right? This is somehow related. Sometimes also it could trigger volcanic eruptions. So all those interdependencies can be worked out in order to allow us to prepare for future scenarios. I wish that had been done, by the responsible people and institutions. I'm sometimes not sure how well we are prepared, but given a lot of advice, my impression is unfortunately not always have people listened well. There are certain drivers of systemic risks. So less redundancies, more networking, higher complexity, faster dynamics, a high pace of innovation. But there are also certain kinds of responding to disasters and basically stopping cascading effects. Redundancies are among those measures, decoupling strategies, diversity, adaptive feedback, transparency and awareness, accountability, incentives, collective intelligence, and so on. In fact, people in our community of complexity and network science have been working on these kinds of problems. And for example, this is work by Hans Hermann and others that has shown that by changing a few connections in the European electricity grid, we could probably reduce the vulnerability a lot. So the danger of blackouts could be reduced significantly with a reasonable amount of investments. Another thing that of course needs to be thought of is basically engineered breaking points to stop cascades, right? Could be fire breaks or whatever. It really depends on the kind of system, but in any network system that could spread bad things, it could also be computer viruses or so. You need to have a way to stop cascades. So that needs to be worked out and be part of the system design. The main point is, however, basically to ensure resilience, and that means basically increasing redundancy, ensuring sufficient diversity, decentralization, modular design, distributed control, subsidiarity, digital assistance, and so on. And just recently, we have been working on a paper was accepted yesterday, basically, on introducing participatory fairness and how this, in order to increase preparedness for emergencies and to support self-organization for survival. So we have basically modified ad hoc networks as they're implemented in our smartphones, such as MeshNet or FireChat. You may have heard about it. So basically, smartphones are able to connect with other smartphones and create a decentralized ad hoc network. This, of course, can be done in different ways. And we've come up with a way that basically creates a hub and spoke network, one might say. So messages are routed through those phones that have most battery. And this way, we can keep up emergency communication for a much longer time. So basically for the critical 3 days after an emergency occurs, this kind of system could keep up communication for basically everyone. And that, of course, increases the benefits for everyone because it's strengthening the social fabric, allows people to self-organize and help themselves and help each other in this way, basically to survive until government help is available, right? So fairness over here would be a principle of survival because it would basically allow us to create more robust networks that can support us in difficult situations. I'd now like to turn to a completely different system I've worked on for some time, which is urban traffic flow. There is a lot of congestion still in many cities. And the question is, couldn't we get rid of this? And then one day when it was still possible to travel, I was in Egypt and I was observing this intersection over here. And I was amazed because there was no traffic light, no policeman, and traffic was just self-organizing and basically nobody had to wait. It just worked automatically. And this is by design. Here we have a unidirectional flow in the front to the right, in the back the opposite flow to the left, and in between there is a buffer that allows people to adjust their speed in such a way that they would find a gap in the flow when they arrive. That's all, And the question is, couldn't we come up with new ways of organizing traffic flow given digital technologies? And of course we can, but the question is how to do it. And here we were inspired by an observation in pedestrian flows at bottlenecks, where there is an oscillatory flow resulting from a pressure principle. We then saw that basically intersections would also be bottlenecks, and we might be able to define a pressure principle that would create self-organized oscillations that could be used to define traffic lights. So basically the idea was that traffic flow could actually control the traffic lights rather than the other way around. In this way, having traffic self-organize itself in a city. Of course, one can do such a thing. The question is, how well does it work? And so let us compare 3 different ways of organizing traffic. One is based on a traffic control center. This is basically collecting data from all over the city and is trying to optimize the traffic light control, and that will be imposed on the entire city. So this traffic control center acts like a benevolent dictator. Just the issue is that traffic light optimization cannot be strictly done in real time. You need to make approximations and simplifications because it's an NP-hard optimization problem. In the middle, we're looking at a principle that might be compared to Homo economicus. Here, each intersection is basically trying to minimize travel times of those cars that are approaching from the neighboring sections. So local optimization, but no coordination between the intersections. As a result, we would think that would cause uncoordinated flows, and that couldn't be as good as what the traffic control center can do. On the right, we're doing the same thing as in the middle, but we're adding a rule to clear a queue that has become large in order to avoid spillover effects into the next intersection. Then only after this, we're going back to travel time minimization. So as a result of this traffic light control that's friendly to the neighbors, other regarding, we would say most likely that will be worse than the thing in the middle because it's not selfish. All right, let's see what really happens. So the red line corresponds to the outcome of top-down control. As we increase capacity utilization to the right, it means increase the traffic flow, the queue lengths resulting behind the traffic lines will grow, more or less linearly, as expected. Now, Homo economicus approach, the selfish optimization locally, will lead to smaller queue lengths up to about the capacity utilization of 0.6. Then suddenly the queue length is exploding. So basically we can say traffic control center is much better for low capacity, the selfish optimization is much better at low capacity utilization, and Adam Smith's invisible hand works. Self-organization is much better than the classical traffic light control. But at high capacity utilization, self-organization breaks down, congestion occurs, and the traffic control center is better. So we can conclude that Adam Smith's invisible hand fails, unfortunately. Not so, however, for the other regarding approach that is friendly to the neighboring intersections and clears large queues before it goes back to travel time minimization. This approach is better all the way. So we can conclude that we can make the invisible hand work, and bottom-up self-organization can actually outsmart optimal top-down control. Why is this? Now, basically because we're not restricting ourselves to a periodic service. We rather have a flexible response to the real demand, and it could be that one direction will be served twice while other directions would be served just one time. We could have non-periodic solutions. Green times would very much adaptable. The system works even better if we have stochastic arrivals. That means variability in the system as it happens in real traffic systems. It also works when there are many intersections, such as over here at an arterial road, which is crossed by other roads. The combined approach that we have developed, that self-control approach or self-organized control approach, is actually much better all the way. It creates a particular kind of green wave that works not only in one direction, but it works actually in both directions, but it looks differently. It uses gaps in the traffic flow as opportunities rather than trying to impose a certain pattern on the traffic flow. And even in a networked system, as we have it, of course, in all cities, the new self-control approach is actually performing better. These have been theoretical scenarios so far. And the question is, would it also work in a real scenario, given the huge complexity of road networks in Europe and other countries around the world? What you see over here is an area of Dresden where I've been working for some time. And you can see the area highlighted that the traffic control authority has basically given to us to experiment with. I mean, in a computer first. And they just bought a new traffic control software, state of the art, can produce green waves, even adaptive ones. But they couldn't do one thing. They couldn't prioritize public transport as they wanted to do, because a lot of different trams were cutting through this area and buses too. And if you would interrupt the green waves whenever a bus or a tram arrives, basically that would destroy the green wave and congestion would set in and you would have a monster traffic jam in a very short time, and the entire city would be congested over many hours. We, however, were able to come up with a new kind of green wave, which was more adaptive. And in this way, we could prioritize public transport. So waiting times in public transport have been reduced significantly, but not at the cost of car drivers. They also had a benefit, astonishingly enough, and pedestrians and cyclists too. And by the way, the travel times are more predictable, even though the traffic light control of a single intersection is less predictable. Altogether, the control approach that we've developed is also better for the environment. Now let's look into other kinds of systems, logistics and supply chains. There are quite a few similarities between road networks and production networks. So road sections correspond to buffers, travel and delay times to cycle times, congestion queues to full buffers, accidents to machine breakdowns, and so on and so on and so on. All of this can be described by mathematical models. Here, just a simple supply chain. In these supply chains, if there are delayed adaptations, you could have bullwhip effects, which are, of course, very undesirable, but well known actually from real life logistics systems. Of course, with today digital systems that can be partly countered, but let's now look into networked systems, supply networks. Here we find different kinds of interesting dynamics. You could actually have not only a stable behavior corresponding to the overdamped behavior or to the damped oscillations. You could also have growing oscillations, and you could have, as we all know, business cycles, and this is actually what is predicted from those input-output matrices that we have in our real-life economy. The question is, could we basically dampen out those oscillations? And so basically, I've looked at different topologies of supply networks. You can see the linear supply chains producing large oscillations. Over here, that hierarchical network is producing also quite considerable oscillations. However, over here, the thing in the middle, which looks a little bit like a ladder, that has redundancy, alternative delivery ways in the system, it can largely dampen out those oscillations, right? So really the network topology matters a lot. Funny enough, but most likely not by coincidence, the supply network of Intel Technologies looked very much like the one that I just proposed as being the best one in order to avoid those bullwhip effects. We've then been interested in applying agent-based approaches to production in order to come up with a self-organized approach where basically the packets would talk to each other and would talk to the machines and trigger certain actions like overtaking maneuvers and so on. And even we've been working on social cooperative production layout where the arrangement of those different machines could basically be varied by an evolutionary algorithm in order to figure out better layouts. I'd like to end this part with simulation by Kai Formans, who has shown how the logistics of this system is changing from a direct way system to a rotary organization counterclockwise when the load of the system goes up. All of this is also based on self-organization if you just have the right kinds of interactions defined in the system. This, of course, is a very nice transition to a problem that our society faces. We really need to replace supply chains that are using resources in a wasteful way by a circular economy. Because our economy at the moment is not sustainable, we're throwing away in industrialized countries about 50 tons of waste in a lifetime. And it cannot stay like this. It's really a matter of life and death in the coming decades, whether we learn to recycle resources or not. The question is how to build that circular economy. And we haven't been very successful doing that by political regulation. So I'm proposing a different approach based on empowerment and coordination, using the Internet of Things that can now be used basically to cheaply measure a lot of variables in our environment. In particular, we could quantify the impact of decisions and actions on our environment and others. For that reason, some time back, we've been working on a concept of a nervous net that could actually measure things like noise, for example, in a city, or light, or if you have the right kind of sensors, CO2 or air quality and these kind of things. But that wouldn't be all. In order to improve the system, you would have to increase positive externalities, reduce negative ones, and ensure fair compensation. And for this, you'd need to define also an incentive system. And it should be multi-dimensional, in fact. We've pointed out many times that now digital technology is allowed to define those new currencies that can be directly coupled with measurement processes. So in a sense, every measurement process could define a new currency and could be used for creating real-time feedbacks. In this way, new forces would be introduced in the economy that would be promoting a co-evolutionary process in our economy that would lead to a circular economy and sharing economy eventually. A multidimensional approach, of course, is a paradigm change, right? There are many things that matter in society and in every city, which ranges from prosperity over health, over education, over justice, and so on. And all of that, funny enough, is mapped on a one-dimensional quantity, which is money. So there are many goals, but optimization neglects all goals but one. It's not a good control system for a complex system. And while this is a typical supply network of today, nature comes up with very different designs. As you see over here, this is a metabolic network. Now we could certainly say the body is an amazing self-organizing system, but it's not based on one-dimensional feedback and control. There are many feedback cycles, not just water, carbohydrates, proteins, vitamins, minerals, and so on. Of course, they're coupled. So why don't we introduce a multi-dimensional monetary system? And in fact, this is what we propose. We call it Finance 4.0, a socio-ecological finance system where you would have different currencies and different incentives in order to allow for a better control of complex systems and in fact, feedbacks for self-control. So we could build self-organizing systems in our economy and society altogether. And I believe with a multidimensional value exchange system, there are many more possibilities to find solutions that benefit all. And I've been working on an idea for an interaction support processor, which is very much geared towards creating symbiosis in a system, right? By infusing the right kinds of interactions and network links in a sense. So that's the approach. Synergy and cybernetics coming together to form synergetics based on self-organization principles. Same thing could be done in our social system, in our society. We should build digital democracy, learn to bring the best ideas of many minds together, learn to combine different perspectives. And in fact, collective intelligence is based on diversity and not the one best solution. It's about the combination of different solution approaches. And so we should build digital democracy based on such principles, bring together the value of ideas around the world in all the cultures that exist, and support this process by incentive schemes. City Olympics would be one way of doing that. So here's my intermediate summary. Network effects do make all the difference. We experience a transition now from a component-dominated to an interaction-dominated world. Combinatorial innovations, that means information ecosystems, could boost the economy. Collective intelligence could boost democracy in our society, and multidimensional real-time feedback, a socio-ecological finance system could be very beneficial for nature. Now, in the process of all this, I've learned some further lessons. So first of all, centralized control has its limits, even given super intelligence, say, assuming that it would exist. Because there are many complex systems out there which vary largely, which are hardly predictable, where are stochastic effects and perturbations and all this. In these systems, it's better to have some level of autonomy and self-organization, flexible response to the actual situation. And we've learned that in the connection with the self-control of traffic lights, where we've really shown the success of this in computer simulations, but also actually in real life implementations. And that work has been largely done with Stefan Lemmer. He's made major contributions. And we've said already back in 2009, we cannot control everything top down. That was published in a magazine by Siemens, so they knew it. In 2011, we had an article that said a chaotic traffic light control would let traffic flow better. The thing got even an award. But, you know, at that time, the world was not prepared for this new kind of thinking. So here was a large article in the Tagesanzeiger, a Swiss newspaper. It says a revolutionary idea of the professor: traffic controls the traffic lights. And then it says Zurich is afraid of more traffic if Helbing's plan works too well. So have you ever heard that a plan could work too well? Well, in the end, you know, this thing was not done. There was basically, people were either not understanding the principle or they were afraid of a new way of organization of the traffic system and maybe our society altogether, right? But that's kind of typical. So if you come up with an idea that is to change everything, be prepared that in the beginning people would say it's completely impossible, and then they would say, well, maybe it's possible, but it's not worth doing. And then once you have your breakthrough, they would say, okay, I said it was a good idea all along. That's the experience that has been made many times. Fooling around with alternating currents is just a waste of time. Nobody will ever use it, said Thomas Edison. And now we're using it every day, right? It's a great invention, but who would want to use it anyway, said Rutherford Hayes, a US president, after the demonstration of Alexander Bell's telephone. I think there's a world market for maybe 5 computers, said Thomas Watson, chairman of IBM in 1943. Or while theoretically and technically television may be feasible, commercially and financially, it is an impossibility. Now, of course, those inventions are much bigger than traffic light control, but the implications of this new self-control approach are much bigger. In a sense, you know, it's a battle between the idea of a future self-organizing digital democracy against the concept of super intelligence that would basically control society altogether.
Dirk,
That battle
just
basically
briefly,
has happened. Yes?
it's 20 past.
I'm almost done.
Okay, super.
This battle has happened back in 2015 in a sense. But then at that time, you know, big data and artificial intelligence basically had been chosen by political decision makers. Future ICT was pushed down basically, and also the traffic light control was turned down. And instead, something happened that I suggest you to figure out. Basically, a global control center has been built based on big data, surveillance data. And the idea was that we could actually represent every object of the world in that system, including our interactions, and figure out how we interact and how those interactions could be steered by a control center. Just the question is, how would you have to connect to society and its individuals? Now, if you just get one thing wrong, then basically you would be in trouble. And I said, you know, this is never going to work. They cannot even optimize traffic flow in real time. And then it took a few years, and eventually they did the test in Lucerne, which is 30 minutes from Zurich. And there they have tested what they now call smart traffic lights or super traffic lights, you know. This thing was even tested by ETH. I was not even informed about that. The system was implemented by my previous PhD student with compagnons. And it turned out that actually green times could be increased for everyone, which sounds like an impossibility, but in fact, this is the outcome of that flexible self-control. And so now the principle has been proven. It's clear that the self-control is superior to all the other systems that are out there. You might ask, of course, what is about machine learning? couldn't machine learning or AI do better than that? Well, it turns out it takes a lot of time for it to learn to control the system well. And then it only gets better if you basically infuse knowledge from the self-control system into the learning process. But looking at energy consumption consumed by digital technology, which was 3% some years back, but it will be more than 20% in 2030 if we continue this way. It seems like applying artificial intelligence to certain complex problems may just be a base of energy, and there may be just much better solutions. So, you know, let me remind you, this is a matter of life and death, because if there are short resources, as are also in the traffic system, right, which is traffic capacity or road capacity, then you would run into troubles, congestion. But in reality, in a non-sustainable system, a lot of people would die if you don't organize that system well. The solution proposed by the elites, in a sense, is to apply the trolley problem. And basically, if not everyone can survive, people will be prioritized, and there would be triage, and that would be basically supported by digital systems based on the individual value of life that's being attributed to you. I think we shouldn't do such a thing. And in fact, there's enough food throughout the world. We're just wasting a lot of food. It's a problem of bad logistics, in a sense. And I've just shown you that we can do things much better in terms of logistics. So in many cases, it turns out that simple models have more predictive power and perform better. So if you use a machine learning approach with perhaps thousands or millions of variables, will it perform better? No, because if there's just one data, what kind of data that matters, why should you distract your machine learning system with all sorts of other information?
Just to interrupt briefly, we are already in the break.
Right.
So there's only 4 minutes left until the next speaker will start. And it would be great exactly at this point, because now you've shown those fundamental political issues as well of this. Just to maybe briefly open the floor for a very short.
Absolutely. So I'm happily
discussion.
Waiting for questions and comments.
Thank you very much for this fascinating talk. Yeah, and it has been more inspiring than ever. It's amazing. So many avenues, so many applications, so many. But then this underlying philosophy or this underlying approach of decentralized solutions and contrasting where the mainstream is going in terms of big data, machine learning, and so on. And it's really, yeah. Now you mentioned in this slide actually also big data. And given that we actually also have a datathon, not a big datathon. Well, it's going to be probably a big datathon, but there is this focus also on data, and I think it's very good to have this critical reflection on which solutions are potentially better. So, well, yeah, what's your take on this huge big data movement?
I do think that big data analytics is often not doing a good job. If you take, for example, predictive policing, pre-crime software, then basically there are more than 90%, sometimes more than 99% of false alarms, false positives. So we have to be very careful with how we are using big data. I prefer data science, a combination of using big data, but taking a scientific approach and feeding in understanding of systems like traffic or epidemic systems in order to make sense of these data. But you know, even though we have more data and better technology than ever, complexity is exploding even faster. and we're losing control. And that's why we need to move from top-down control to distributed control. That's what I think.
Mm-hmm.
I think
Thank
Mark had a question or comment.
So exactly, now I can't see anything in the chat written.
So,
yes, Mark?
Maybe I can just ask one question, Dirk. Wonderful presentation, and there's a lot of stuff that I would love to discuss. But I'd like to ask one question with the PhD students of the whole network in mind. The one thing that I see from your presentation is that on the one hand, you have these causality networks, which are a representation of the multitude of phenomena that drive a complex system. And on the other hand, you use tremendously simple models to highlight something that, as far as I see from your presentations, you sense to be an unavoidable fact how a system behaves. So how do you find the balance between these things, the simple models and this tremendous wealth of phenomena that contribute to the behavior of a complex system?
Well, of course, the first principle should be that we shouldn't build systems that are so complex that they're not manageable anymore, right? So there could be systems that are beyond what can be managed well in any way. And then those would be unstable and they would fall apart. And unfortunately, that's what could happen to world society, you know, if we don't pay attention. So modularization is certainly important. And as you know very well from complexity science, a lot of complex functionality can be built from simple interactions, right? I think it's worth learning how to do that, because also this self-organization approach is an approach that still leaves place for freedom, creativity, innovation, and self-determination. If you go the road of super intelligence, trying to optimize the world, failing to do that precisely, trying to control people, you know, this is just going to end in totalitarianism. And if you want to know how the story ends, well, you've just read that Google is going to stop profiling and targeting people. So the battle basically is decided and we're going to move into a new time.
Just
Thank
briefly,
you very much.
I need to ask Lara briefly about the next, because we are already now, we're supposed to start the next presentation. Sorry for not having seen your raised hands all. I'm seeing them now. What shall we do, Lara? Is there...
Maybe if people could post their questions in the chat, and maybe if you could answer them in the chat window, then we can all see them. But I think we'll have to move now to stick to schedule.
Yeah, we need to.
And I think the next speaker is here with us. So yeah, I don't know, maybe we can have Francisco, if you are there.
Yes.
I don't know if hello, Francisco.
Hello, can you see me?
For being here.
Thank you very much, Vicky.
Maybe it could be a good idea if we have a 5 minutes break.
Whatever you want.
Do not start immediately after.
I'm fine with that.
Yeah, thank you, Francisco.
Okay, see you in 5 minutes then.
It would be, yes. Yeah, all right, see you in 5 minutes.
Okay.
So yeah, thank you very much, Dirk, for your presentation. So for those who have questions, post them in the chat.
Yeah, or just, you know, I will be around for these 5 minutes. So
my one is long to write. Can I ask it maybe during the break?
Yeah, sure. Why not just take the break for those interested? Yes.
You know, it's an easy question, but it's long to write. So excellent talk, first of all, thanks. And you showed actually the advantages of self-organization, for instance, in traffic, these traffic regulation, which is actually amazing. However, sometimes these traditional control paradigms are maybe not effective, but are designed not only for effectivity, but also for avoiding failures. The self-organized system, on the contrary, evolve automatically toward a better overall performance, but sometimes you have failures, they are isolated and stochastic, but they can be very strong. And actually in societal context, a single but dramatic failure may have a big cost. Do you explore also the probability of extreme events of failure, for instance, because you focus pretty much on average performance, but what is the other side? Even if it's rare and on average doesn't occur, it may be dramatic.
I do think that we're going to see difficult times ahead, and that we have to be prepared for disruptions in systems and for failures. So basically, one of the main abilities that we'll need is the ability to recover quickly and soon and to improve over previous solutions. So we really need to reorganize our society in a resilient and flexible way. Trying to harden it so it could not be disrupted. I think this would totally underestimate the powers of globalization and other challenges that are acting on our system. So we better prepare now. Maybe it's already late, but we should certainly do everything we can to prepare for that flexible, adaptive system design.
Okay, so your point is that if you design resiliency, you don't have to care, in a sense, about prediction of the problems because you are resilient. Okay, thanks.
Next one, Mario, maybe?
Yeah, there's also, just to let you know, like 2 new questions from Christian in the chat as well. So yes, if you want to answer them later. And on my behalf, I just wanted to ask, because you were, for example, for a traffic light, you were putting the example of like Egypt, which was like functioning and it was amazing. But then you kind of go to this solution that is based on technology dependent, like it's basically based on these sensors and this like intelligent traffic lights. What I wanted to ask is like, what is the role in the way you perceive things? Because I understand that you go for the traffic lights because then you gather the data and then you optimize the process. But in the Egyptian case, what is the role that you take for social innovations, which take data gathering is way more difficult, but they could lead to the same results and are not technology dependent. So maybe they are like more resilient towards like systemic failures that are related with failures in technology, for example.
I mean, basically it shows you don't need necessarily to have really very expensive technology in order to come up with good solutions, right? You need to be creative in the first place. Now, of course, we would never implement such a solution, say, in Germany or Switzerland. We would say it's too dangerous. There's maybe a high accident rate, right? But with the Internet of Things, we could basically create safe and self-organizing systems. And this is what we should be trying to do. Unfortunately, I somehow sense that we have this paradigm that car companies are trying to really centrally control the movement of all cars. So they're very much on this trip towards centralized control. And I think this is not going to work well, and it will be very bad for society. While we have shown already many years back that also for freeways, there are decentralized solutions to get rid of congestion, create fluid flow. So I think there's a lot of ideology in the solution approaches that have been taken. The solutions approaches that are centralized are extremely expensive and consuming a lot of power and not well compatible with democracy. So I think we need to have, beside the scientific debate, also a societal debate, because technology and how we use it is not neutral. We can always use technologies in different ways, and we need to be smart in the way we're using it.
I remember you had a great slide of a benevolent dictator as an Adolf Hitler in a pink, with a pink color in it. And yeah, how long the benevolent dictator stays benevolent is
Yeah, the point is, you know, a benevolent dictator is still a dictator, you know, and maybe not be benevolent in the end.
Exactly.
All right.
Thanks,
I will be
thanks a lot for this.
Yeah,
I need to pass.
Sorry for
pass on to Vicky for the next.
It's so interesting discussion. Yes, unfortunately, we need to stay in schedule.